Welcome to my YouTube channel World News HD. It's important to note that the concept of most hated countries can be subjective and vary depending on individual perspectives and sources. However, based on various reports, news articles, and global surveys, here's a list of the top 10 most controversial countries in 2024. 1. North Korea, human rights violations, political oppression, and nuclear weapons program. 2. Syria, ongoing civil war, humanitarian crises, and alleged war crimes. 3. Afghanistan, political instability, terrorism, and human rights concerns. 4. Yemen, civil war, humanitarian crisis, and alleged war crimes. 5. Belarus, political repression, human rights violations, and authoritarian governance. 6. Russia, Ukraine invasion, political interference, and human rights concerns. 7. Iran, political repression, human rights violations, and nuclear program. 8. China, human rights violations, censorship, and geopolitical tensions. 9. Saudi Arabia, human rights violations, women's rights issues, and geopolitical tensions. 10. Myanmar, Burma, Rohingya crisis, human rights violations, and political repression. Please note that this list is not exhaustive or definitive, and opinions may vary depending on individual perspectives and sources. Additionally, it's essential to recognize that every country has its unique challenges and complexities, and it's crucial to approach these topics with nuance and understanding. Here are some more detailed explanations for each country. 1. North Korea, human rights violations, political imprisonment, forced labor, and restricted freedoms. Political oppression, authoritarian regime, censorship, and strict control over citizens' lives. Nuclear weapons program, development of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, despite international sanctions. 2. Syria, ongoing civil war, conflict between government forces, rebels, and extremist groups, resulting in massive humanitarian crises. Humanitarian crises, widespread destruction, displacement, and human rights abuses. Alleged war crimes, chemical attacks, targeting civilians, and other violations of international law.
3. Afghanistan.
Political instability, fragile government, corruption, and ongoing conflict with Taliban insurgents. Terrorism, presence of extremist groups like the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS. Human rights concerns, women's rights issues, child labor, and limited access to education and healthcare. 4. Yemen, civil war, conflict between government forces, Houthi rebels, and Saudi-led coalition, resulting in massive humanitarian crises. Humanitarian crisis, widespread destruction, displacement, and human rights abuses. Alleged war crimes, targeting civilians, blockade of aid, and other violations of international law. 5. Belarus, political repression, authoritarian regime, suppressed political opposition, and restricted freedoms. Human rights violations, crackdown on protests, political imprisonment, and censorship. Authoritarian governance, strict control over citizens' lives, limited political participation, and suppressed civil society. 6. Russia, Ukraine invasion, annexation of Crimea, support for separatist rebels, and ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine. Political interference, meddling in foreign elections, disinformation campaigns, and support for authoritarian regimes. Human rights concerns, suppression of political opposition, restricted freedoms, and alleged war crimes in Ukraine.
7. Iran.
Political repression, authoritarian regime, suppressed political opposition, and restricted freedoms. Human rights violations, crackdown on protests, political imprisonment, and censorship. Nuclear program, development of nuclear capabilities, despite international sanctions and concerns. 8. China, human rights violations, suppressed political dissent, restricted freedoms, and alleged repression of minority groups. Censorship, strict control over media, internet, and free speech. Geopolitical tensions, territorial disputes, trade wars, and rising global influence. 9. Saudi Arabia, human rights violations, suppressed political dissent, restricted freedoms, and alleged repression of minority groups. Women's rights issues, limited gender equality, restricted freedoms, and guardianship system. Geopolitical tensions, involvement in Yemen war, rivalry with Iran, and human rights concerns. 10. Myanmar, Burma, Rohingya crisis, persecution, displacement, and alleged genocide of Rohingya minority. Human rights violations, suppressed political dissent, restricted freedoms, and alleged repression of minority groups. Political repression, authoritarian regime, suppressed political opposition, and restricted freedoms. Please note that these summaries are brief and don't exhaustively cover all issues in each country. Additionally, it's essential to recognize that every country has its unique challenges and complexities. More news and updates, please subscribe now my channel.